If you want to learn how to load, save, and sync JSON config files in your DayZ mods, then this is the tutorial for you. You're gonna like what I've got. Hey survivors, don't shoot, I'm friendly. I come with gifts. This video tutorial is taken from a giant course I'm putting together on DayZ Modding, teaching everything I've learned about DayZ Modding since I started several years ago. For those who don't know who I am, I go by Zenarchist in DayZ, and I have over 50 mods I think I've made now, and some of them I've published on the workshop, and a lot of them have grown to be quite popular, I think because I'm a big fan of novel content, I'm a big fan of immersion in the game. I'm not saying I'm a great DayZ modder or anything like that, but I have a passion for it. I really enjoy it, maybe a little too much to be honest, and I've got a lot to teach. Not everything I do is probably the best way to do things, so always do your own research and seek help from other people who are more experienced than even I am. But for those of you who are new to DayZ modding, this course I'm putting together will be huge. I wish I had something like this when I started. It would have saved me an insane amount of frustration in trying to learn things the hard way. So if that sounds interesting to you, make sure to hit the subscribe button and like button and all of that. Let me know you're interested in this stuff, because otherwise I'm not going to bother putting the work in to make this content, because it is a lot of work. But if you guys are interested, I'm keen. This tutorial, along with all my mods and any future tutorials, will require community framework as a dependency. So make sure to subscribe to this mod first and have it running on your server, your local server or test server, development server. Otherwise, the code I show you today will not run. Okay, let's go over how to load and save information from a JSON file. So here I have a template config in my template mod folder, and I'll explain the code structure of this file. So anything that is static const is a static constant variable which never changes. It's static and it's constant, so it can never change. These static const parameters will not get saved to a JSON file. So none of these parameters here will actually get saved or loaded from a JSON file. I just use them to reference things within the script of this config template. So mod author is where you should put your modding name. So mine's Zenarchist, so I'll just put Zenarchist in there. And then this would create a folder in my profiles folder called Zenarchist. And then inside that folder would be this file here. And so if you're using my template code, you can just copy this here, paste it in there, and change this to your config name and replace all. And then change this to your modding name, and you've got your own config file ready to go. So this is the data that actually gets saved to the file. So right now I just have a string example config. I could also have an array here if I wanted to have a, let's do a custom class array. So remember, every time you define an array in a global scope, it needs to be a hard reference. So here you could say array string sum array string, and then define that as a config. Maybe this could be, I don't know, like a whitelist of things you're allowed to deploy in a territory. There's a million things you'd use string arrays for. For this example, let's do a custom class. So let's do a ref zen template custom config. And we'll call this example array config. Now I need to define this custom class config. So we'll come down here and we'll say class, paste that in there. And this could be anything. Let's just use like something like a no build zone example template. So what we could have here is string name, vector location, a float no build zone, and maybe we can throw in an array, ref array string whitelist. We won't actually code out the no build zone code because that's pretty complicated to do and will take a long time and probably deserves its own video if we did something like that. For today, let's just focus on defining a custom JSON config class. So now what I can do here is say void and then the same name as my class. I can put in p underscore name is parameter name, vector p underscore location is my world location, float p and no build zone will be my no build zone distance, and we'll leave the whitelist blank for now. So now what I can do is say name equals p underscore name, location equals p underscore location, no build zone equals p underscore no build zone. And let's initialize the whitelist as a new string array, and let's just put in a default whitelist item, let's say fireplace base. So players can place a fireplace in this no build zone. That'll do for now. So this is a custom config definition. Now I can have an array of these definitions. So what I can do is, let's copy this up to our set default values here. And I'll leave that as is for now. And what we'll do is take this and we'll say this equals new array, and it needs to be ref zen template custom config. And then we can say example array config dot insert new this guy. And then here we can put in a name. So let's just say, for an example, we could say Tizzy. The vector location, I don't know where Tizzy is, but let's just say it's 12340 1234. And the no build zone is, let's say, 500 meters. And now if I save this code, when we set our default values, we will create a blank array containing these custom class types, and then we insert this new custom class type. So now what will happen, if I have load on server set to true, this ideally should be a server-side config which syncs to the client. We want to define this information on the server. Then when a player logs in, we want this information to get sent to the player so that their client is aware of the settings. We don't really want the client to load this information themselves, because the server admin should set this info. There are situations where you would only want to load the settings on the client and not on the server. That's why I included these options here. For example, in game settings, maybe you have some sort of interface and there's some setting in there. For example, on my music mod, I've made it so players can force the mod to not play any music that might be copyrighted, for like Twitch streamers that don't want to get copyright strikes and things like that. That would be a client-side setting that the server doesn't need to know about. So that's when I would set this to false, set load on client to true, and set sync to clients to false. And then what we would have is this file would load on the client, but not on the server, and the server would not sync to the client. So that's what we would want in that case. In this case, we want the opposite. We want this to load on the server, not load on the client, and we want to sync from the server to the client. So that can stay true. Client save to server IP is a optional setting. If we were loading and saving on the client, turning this on or setting this to true will save our config files in a folder. First, it'll create our mod author folder. Then it will get the server IP address of the server we are currently connected to, and it will make the file name compatible with Windows. It'll delete the colons and the full stops or periods. It'll set them to blank. And then what we'll end up with is something like this. If I go to my local folder, here is my template example. And then this file here would be my IP address with rcon included and all of the parameters that make my DayZ server unique. If the settings for the client should be server specific, then you'd turn this setting to true. If not, then you can have it as false, and then it will save in the root here. So if your mod is running on multiple servers and your player jumps from server to server, having this turned off will mean the config syncs to all of those servers, so that when they log in, those settings apply to any server they log into. If you set this to true, then it will only apply to the server that they set those settings on. The reason I started adding that feature to my mods was after creating this map marker mod, because the map markers would transfer from server to server, even though they were saved on the client, because any server that loaded my client mod folder would load the map marker. So by segregating specific config into specific server IP addresses, you can get around that issue. That being said, this is a very niche situation in DayZ Modding when it comes to client saving data, so you probably don't need to worry about this, but I included it in the template since it's not exactly a straightforward thing to figure out on your own. So anyway, in this case, we want to load on server. We don't want to load on client. We don't care about the server IP, so I'll just leave that as true for now, the default value. And we do want to sync to clients. Here we have a version config versioning. So if I set this to 2, when the game loads this config file, it will check if the config versions don't match, then it will save the current JSON config to a backup file called whatever it is currently _old, and create a new file with all of the new default parameters. Otherwise, if the config versions do match after the JSON file loader loads our file, then this will load in whatever parameters are saved to the file, and we stop here and this code doesn't get run. If we have a version mismatch, then our config version is set to the current version and we save the new file. So if you make a radical update to your JSON structure and it breaks the old structure, if you don't change this number, then the mod will try to load the old file and it could corrupt things, cause server crashes, all kinds of issues, because it's trying to match incorrect information to new JSON structure. There are better ways to go about this. I just find this the simplest way. I very rarely need to do this, but I like to have the option to if I need to. So that's why I left this in the template code. So now what will happen is when we load this file, and I'll show you how to do that in a second, we get our server IP if we're on the client. We set our default values. If we're running on the client, we check if we should load on the client. If not, we stop here. We don't load anything. If we are on the client and we are supposed to load on the client and we have client saved to server IP, then we get our server IP. If not, this gets skipped and we leave this blank. Then we check, are we on the dedicated server? If so, should this load on the server? If not, stop here. If we make it this far, then we're either on the client and we're allowed to load on the client, or on the server and we're allowed to load on the server. So now we check if our JSON file exists in this folder structure, then load that file using the DayZ's JSON file loader functionality. In our triangle brackets here, we need to put in the class name that we want to load. So that is going to be our config file. And then we can say JSON load file and then pass in a file path and then tell it what to load this data into. So this tells this line of code, load this file as this class and apply the values to this class, to this instance of our class. And so what that will do is when our file loads, example config will be set to whatever it is in the JSON file, and our array here will be loaded as whatever's in our JSON file. And when we save, we do exactly the same thing. We get our folder structure, make sure the files exist. If they don't, we make the directory. Now keep in mind, DayZ, when you make a directory, it can only make one directory at a time. So if you're nesting your folders like this, utilities, etc., you need to create each folder individually, or the game won't save your file properly if you have nested folders. Most people won't, but just want to let you know, because you can get caught out by that, as I have in the past. And then finally, once we have all the information we need to build our file path, then we use JSON file loader to save this time. So now we're telling it, save to this file path as this class structure from this instance. So now when we call the save function, that's going to take whatever we've set up here and save it to the file. So if this is the first time we boot up our server, the default values will be set. If the file doesn't exist, then we'll create our default values and save the JSON file. If the file does exist, then we'll load those values. So then finally down here under where I've defined my custom config class, we have our getter method. So this static Zen template config get Zen template config. If we call this, we can, because this is in the global scope, notice this isn't within our class if I minimize the class and this class, we have these two classes here. This is in the global scope of the entire DayZ script directory of 3game, which means we can call getZenTemplate literally anywhere in our code and it will run. We can call it here. I think we can even call it in the global scope. I don't know why you do that, but it's accessible in all scopes because we defined it in the global scope. If we took this and put it inside our class, now we would have to call zen_template_config.getZenTemplateConfig, and that's how we would call it. But because this is a master config file, and we kind of want this to be accessible everywhere and be convenient to grab, I'm happy to leave this in the main scope. And what this static method, which is accessible everywhere, does is it checks if our instance of our config file does not exist. So if not m_zen_template_config, this is the same as saying if our config instance is null, then we initialize a new instance. So m_zen_template_config equal new, and I can throw on some empty brackets there to make this obvious. It's a constructor call. So now we construct a new config instance and then we load it immediately. And the load function, of course, will set our default values. It'll check all this. If the file doesn't exist, it skips all this. It sets the config version and saves the default values to file. If, however, the file does exist, then it will simply load the data. And then it returns that instance. And this is the instance of our config that we will be working with in every time we call this function. So now to wrap this up, I can jump to, because this is going to be a server-side config, we can go to mission server in our 5mission folder. On init is called when the server initializes or loads up. We can immediately call our getZenTemplateConfig. This function will load the config as well. So we can just simply call getConfig. That will load the file and have it ready to go when the player logs in. Now when a player logs in, because we've set sync to clients to true, because this is true, we are using the community framework mod to send an RPC. I have a detailed RPC guide on the way, but first things first, let's focus on the config. This just sends data from the server to the client. We're saying send this data to this function, which will be in mission base. I'll show you in a second. So this is a new param, so a new single parameter object with our ZenTemplate config as the parameter, and we pass in our getZenTemplateConfig. We set this to true. I can't remember what this does, but I always have it as true. So sorry, I should probably know what that does, but anyway, just leave it as true if you're in doubt, and pass in the player identity. And that will send our config to this player when they log in to our server. And then over on mission base, this is where we add our listener for this function. So remember, when the player logs in, we send RPC to this category of RPCs, this function name. So over on mission base, we add a listener to this category and this function name. So these are, well, these need to be identical. And then we throw in our parameter here, which is a single parameter. You can have multiple parameters. So we could have a Boolean value thrown in there and change this to 2. And then we could set this to like a debug parameter or something if we needed to. But because we're sending config, I'm happy to just send it as one config file reference. And then over on mission base, here we can add listeners on the server and the client. So the client can send data to the server this way as well. But for this video, we're going to focus on the server sending data to the client. So here we have add RPC, category, function name. This class is where we want this function to be. And this doesn't really matter unless you're running on offline mode. And so now if I come down to our function here, this is the server sending to the client. So RPC_receive ZenTemplateConfig. What we need to do here is define our parameter that we're reading. This needs to be the exact same data type that we're sending. So that's this here. So a single parameter with a hard ref for our ZenTemplateConfig. By the way, the reason this is a hard ref is so the game doesn't automatically garbage collect this and delete it when it isn't being used for a moment in our script. We want this to persist for as long as the server's running, and making it a ref ensures that happens. And so this gets sent to this function, and on the client, this function will execute. It will read from this context. You don't have to understand all these keywords. You just need to know what the code is doing as a template if you want to adjust this. So in this class here, this CTS class is going to contain all of the data sent from the server to the client. We're going to read that data into this parameter. If that fails, so if this returns false, then there's some sort of error. Usually that will mean we sent the wrong data type from the server. But if these match, then it should read fine. And then what we can do is set our global scope config variable, this guy here, to what we just received from the server. So I know this gets quite confusing. It took me a long time to get second nature and comfortable with this concept, but data.param1 is parameter 1 from the data we're reading. So that'll be this thing here. If we sent two parameters like this, and the second parameter was a Boolean value, we could say treat that second parameter as a Boolean value. They get automatically typecast to whatever we sent and received based on this these arrow brackets. But we only have a single parameter, and the data type is our custom config class. So we can set our custom config instance here in the global scope to the first parameter, and then we can read off some data from this. And now remember, this getter will return this if it's null. So I can change that to that. And now what we could do is do a for loop. We could say for I equals 0, I under config example array config dot count I plus plus. So this loop is now going to cycle through all of the elements of our example array, and we can print them out on the client and see some information out of it. So we can say received no build zone, and then we can get the custom config equals get I. So now we're getting whatever the current element we're looping over is, and now we can check what name it is. And we can say the no build distance is no build zone. So custom config.no build zone. And now we'll quickly compile this and see if I've made any mistakes. I probably have. And that actually seems fine. I'm genuinely surprised by that. I haven't made any typos so far. That's good. Let's load up the game now and see if this works as intended. And I just realized this isn't going to work as intended because I haven't deleted my local template config since I changed the structure. Delete the file and force it to regenerate the template file since we added this custom array to it. So don't forget to do that when you're developing your mod. Sometimes you'll need to delete your JSON file to force the game to regenerate a new one if you're adding new config parameters to your existing file. Or of course you can change this number here. That's the point of this. But when you're developing your mod, you don't need to have backups of your old files. It doesn't matter. So now we can load back in and let's see if our data successfully gets transmitted to the client. So now I can go to my local DayZ logs. I'll delete all of these files. We can open up the script log, and once we've loaded in, I can check my file here, and here we go. We have received our example config data, and we go to my server. We open up my example template. Here is our template. We could change this to, let's change it to Zelenogorsk and change the no build zone to 250. We can say Zelenogorsk military. Well, actually, I'm on Livonia, so let's go to Swarog or something. Yeah, let's go to Swarog. We'll hit P to copy my position. And then down here, we can paste my position into there. We'll leave that as 250, change this to Swarog military as a no build zone, different string info, and let's just test if this loads when I shut down my server and reboot it with the changed config. So now the server should load this JSON config we just edited, and when I log in on the client, this information here should match this information. And of course, we could be printing all of the information from this config. We could also print the whitelist and the vector location and so on. Actually, let's print the whitelist just to make sure our sub array is copying over correctly, because sometimes I've found directly copying a config class like this can have some issues when you're working with maps and arrays. So what we can do here is add let's add the vector. So that's location. And then let's have a second loop here that loops through our whitelist and prints. Let's use our custom name here for our no build zone. And we can say whitelist item name equals, and then get X from our whitelist loop. And before we do that, let's make sure this code did sync properly. Refresh my script logs, and yep, there we go. Different string info, Swarog military, and this is on my client logs. This is on my game client local PC logs, not my server logs. So my server info is correctly syncing to the client. Let's exit the game here and add a couple of things to our fireplace. Let's add Zen note. Let's add, we'll add Zen sleeping bag. These are all examples of items that you wouldn't mind a player placing in this no build zone. Medium tent, maybe you don't mind them placing tents there, you just don't want them base building there. So now what you could do is override your deploy action, the vanilla deploy action, scan through your no build zones just like this, check the distance from where the player currently is to each location. If the distance is less than this, then you can check what item they're trying to deploy. If it's not included on the whitelist, then you can stop them from deploying it and you've got a no build zone. That's, as I said, a much more complicated thing. I'm not going to show that in this video. For now, we just want to make sure we're transmitting our data from our JSON config from the server to the client successfully. So let's compile this last version and make sure our array is printing properly. There we go, no typos it looks like, which is great. Let's load up. All right, now let's check our script logs. So I need to open up the latest one that was created, come down to here. And I forgot to save my file, so we're still printing the old one, but that's fine, that's good. Now I can shut down my server and we can see if it updates, loads the new information, and successfully sends it to the client. So let's see what happens. All right, we're back in, reload my file, and perfect. Everything's working perfectly. We are receiving our text string and our array of no build zones. I could add another build zone in here. We could say this could be maybe lookout airfield, and I could change these values to whatever that is in game. I'm not going to bother now. We could change this to 1,000 meter no build zone, and maybe we can only place fireplaces there. Let's restart our server and make sure that works. All right, let's load in and see what we get. There we go. Swarog military, coordinate locations all match up. We've got our whitelist array and they're different for both. Perfect. Everything's working perfectly. We've got a really good template code here to build on and work with. So as mentioned, the source code to this template file will be on my GitHub. There'll be a link below. Before we wrap up, let me go over just some really simple example code for a no build zone. So this is a mod I created. It's almost identical. I've got a Zen no build zone, which is if I come to config and we go to Zen base building config, it's exactly the same setup I just showed you. Mine's called Zen no build zone. If we come down to Zen no build zone, we have the zone name. We have a warning message that notifies the player, a position, a minimum distance, an ignore height. And we also have a global whitelist of items you can deploy. And if we come to my action deploy object where I override the vanilla action condition, when we're running this code on the server, I scan through all of my no build zones, get each zone, check my position and the distance to that position. If the item I have in my hands that I'm trying to deploy is on my whitelist, then I'm allowed to deploy it. Otherwise, if it's not found on my whitelist, then a notification gets sent to the player telling them how far they need to move away from the current no build zone area, and it cancels their placement action and returns false, so they cannot deploy objects in this area. That's almost exactly the same utilization of a config file as this one. If you want to check out my no build zone code for whatever reason, go to my GitHub and look up my Zen mod pack source code. It has a huge amount of code in here that you can reference as example code if you need to. With that said, I'll wrap this lesson up here and I'll speak with you in the next one. Take care, survivors.